Alright boys, so it's been a fat minute since I've uploaded on the Bleach Hub channel, but I was on vacation and really didn't have a lot of time to actually get any of these videos done, so I hope you guys can forgive me for not getting any content out, and hopefully this video does make up for it. I am working on some other things as well. Like, there is a Medaka and an Anos video in the works. I know people are really wanting to see those videos, so those are in the works, as well as I can finally announce an Aizen versus Madara video is in the works. As well as like a Yugi versus Ash or a Yugi versus Red video. I kind of want to do that Yu-Gi-Oh versus Pokemon matchup. I'm just not sure if I want to use Ash or Red because I'm not sure which one is a bit more fitting because, Ash is like the poster child of the Pokemon series, but Red is just way cooler. So I don't really know which one to use, but those are some videos that are going to be coming up hopefully within this month. Like, hopefully I'm able to get them done while I'm still on break from school. So let's hope we can get that done. But in this video, we're going to be bringing it back to Magi with an Alibaba versus Ichigo video, because I realized I really never got to talk about Alibaba, and I really wanted to because he's one of the more fascinating characters in the Magi series, and he, alongside Aladdin, kind of both serve as the protagonist for the series. So instead of doing Aladdin versus Ichigo, which is a little weird because they're not really the same type of fighters. I mean, Aladdin's more of a magician and Ichigo's more of a big beat stick, and that fits more in line with what Alibaba is wanting to do. So I think this fits more as a matchup. You guys should know how we do things on the Bleach Hub channel. We're going to go over their power, speed, and abilities, and talk about who should win if these two were to come to blows. Now, before we begin, if you guys like any power scaling content, make sure you leave a like and subscribe on the video. It really does help the channel out a lot. You can click that join button to become a channel member to get access to channel member exclusive content, like debates and past live streams that I do upload for channel members exclusively. I have a Twitch where I stream on the weekdays, a second channel where I talk about FGO, all of that good stuff down in the description down below. But with all that being said, let's go ahead and get a nice refresher course on our boy Ichigo, the home field combatant. Now, just to also clarify, I'm only going to be using end of series Ichigo in this video because I don't really think it's fair to use lower versions of Ichigo. Like, let's not cap around and act like they stand any modicum of a chance against Alibaba. We need the final end of series Ichigo for this to not be an absolute wash. Thankfully, when we do get to end of series Ichigo, this dude is definitely strong enough to hold his own against Alibaba. Remember that Ichigo is basically the second strongest person in the series by the end of the series, really only being outranked by a full power Yuha, meaning he does get all of the nice feats and scaling that happened in the 1,000-Year Blood War, where it's like Bankai Yamamoto, just by passively existing, is going to destroy the entirety of the Soul Society, which we know is a mirror dimension to the world of the living, which at the bare minimum is already putting him at solar system level, because we know both dimensions have a star in them, meaning that they not only have to be large enough to contain the star, but also the space to contain said star, meaning it would be about solar system in size. But you could honestly argue that both of these realms should be universal in size if you want to say that the world of the living is supposed to be our universe, or that it's supposed to be comparable in size to something like Mundo when the Soul King is like over here like splitting all the dimensions apart. If you think that they should all just be 3 levels of infinities and should all be relative in size, then this is already an infinite level feat. Thankfully, we don't really need to argue that because we have other feats and showings to put Ichigo this high. I'm just saying, even with some of the lower feats that you get at the beginning of the 1,000-Year Blood War, you can already argue that they're infinite in power. But moving on, then you have the Gremmy feat, where Gremmy actually just creates a pocket dimension that is multi-galaxy in size pretty casually, and yet being able to do something like that is still unable to imagine anything stronger than Kenpachi, or even a body to contain Kenpachi's power. Meaning Kenpachi just kind of vibes at being low multi-galaxy just passively, just really easy feat for him right there. But nobody cares about all this low tier gibberish. You guys want to know about the universal multiversal stuff, right? And that all comes from Ichigo's real dad, Yuha, over here, taking over the Soul King and just becoming the god of the verse, in which his first act is to destroy everything and recreate the entire Bleach cosmology. Now, even at a baseline level, this just fits the qualifications for universal, because even if the universes in Bleach, Mundo, the world of the living, and the Soul Society, weren't infinite in size, the definition for a baseline universal character is that they're destroying everything within their universe, which at its most bare bones level is what Yuha is doing. So even at the lowest level, this should qualify as universal, and the argument is whether or not it's multiversal or not. Which I actually think it's more accurate to say it's more like multi-universal, not multiversal, because multiversal is more like a 5D construct that contains a bunch of infinite 4D spaces, whereas Yuha's feat is more like he'd be destroying numerous 4D constructs, It would almost just be like multi-planetary on a larger scale. Like, you wouldn't just grant somebody solar system level just because they could destroy a couple planets. It's kind of like the same concept, although it's kind of harder to explain because it's higher dimensions. But just know, outside of the one interview for the Hellverse movie, which even the translations for that are a bit dodgy as to whether or not they were actually talking about the multiverse or not, outside of that, there really is no mention of M theory or the multiversal theory in Bleach, and it just seems to be more consistent that these characters are pretty casually able to destroy universes, and that's kind of where they're capping out for now, although maybe the anime will give some clarifying statements, or maybe the manga with its return will also give some clarifying statements. It's kind of hard because Kubo's a bit more of a poetic writer, and it's hard to really pin him down on a lot of these things. But just based on his scaling too, Yuha, who at baseline is going to be destroying everything in the Bleach verse, which fits the base definition for universal, Ichigo should scale to being universal, seeing as this guy just killed Yuha twice. So I don't want to hear anybody saying like, well, maybe Ichigo doesn't scale to Yuha. It's like, bro, he killed him twice. Like, it doesn't get more blatant than you just murking a dude 2 times in a row. But then everything else for Ichigo is pretty simple. The AP scaling is really the most complex part because you guys know speed. It's quite simple. I've gone over this calc just a numerous amount of times on the channel. And essentially, it just takes Ichigo flying from the Soul Palace to the Soul Society. We know that it took him about half a day. We know Ichigo by this point in the series should be at the bare minimum the speed of light. And it generally puts the distance between the two areas at being like a couple solar systems. Some people get a couple galaxies that they're more highballing Ichigo's speed, but I always use just Ichigo being the speed of light because it's a very consistent low end that we can all agree to. And then you have things like the Mimehage and the Ashwall and traveling that same distance in like 2.5 seconds. And depending on the value for time that you say that the Mimehage and the Ashwall are traveling between the two, like if you say they're actually traveling in 2 seconds, or maybe you're saying they travel in 5 seconds, it generally puts you in like anywhere from the 10 mil to the 2 million times the speed of light range. And this would apply to base Ichigo because he's capable of reacting to people like Yuha or the Quincy girls in his base form as well. And then he has his Bankai and his full hollow form on top of that. And if the full hollow form still gives him a speed boost like the Bankai does, this man could be anywhere upwards of 100 million times the speed of light, which is insanely fast. Again, just do keep in mind that this speed calc does have a lot of values to it. It just depends on mainly what you think Ichigo's starting speed was and how long you think it took the Ashwell and the Mimehage to travel from the Soul Palace to the Soul Society. Then we get to Ichigo's abilities, and I mean, it's pretty generic beat stick stuff from here. I mean, he can shoot giant laser beams. He can fly, technically, depending on where he's at. He is a spiritual entity, which is the main thing, which means he's invisible to people that don't have astral awareness, although the problem is that most verses, if they're worth their salt in any sort of capacity, have some level of astral awareness. Like, most verses do deal with ghosts or spirits in some capacity. So while Ichigo does have like this passive invincibility, it's not the best passive invincibility because it's just relying on people being able to see ghosts, but it is there. More importantly and more impressively, he has a Zanpakuto, which is literally a soul cleansing sword, which is not only really good because it lets him bypass durability and just attack the opponent's soul directly, but you could also argue that it does some level of like BFR to their soul, because if they were a good person, the Zanpakuto is going to send their soul to the Soul Society, or if they were a bad person, it's going to BFR their soul to the Hell Dimension. So it's like a double wombo combo of being able to bypass durability and BFR that person's soul. And obviously this is very good because most people need their soul to, you know, just kind of be alive in general. So it makes Ichigo's abilities very strong. But other than that, there's not a whole lot of things that are really worth noting here. I mean, like, his hollow powers kind of give him regeneration sometimes. Like, during the Soul Society arc, he kind of lived the fight with Renji because his Hollow Mask was there and was, like, kind of protecting him, quote-unquote. Or after his full Hollow transformation, Ulquiorra's hole that he blasted in Ichigo's chest was healed by his Hollow power. So just, like, little things here and there. But they're not consistent enough for me to be like, oh yeah, he should have some, like, passive regen, because it's pretty inconsistent when he does or does not use it, or when he, like, the Hollow Ichigo just wants to heal him or not. Like, it's really inconsistent. Unfortunately, he doesn't use any of his Quincy abilities. Like, those would actually be really good because Quincy arrows have the ability to erase things from existence. Like, they remove them from the cycle of reincarnation. But Ichigo's just like, man, I don't really want to use my Quincy abilities, which is why I'm kind of hoping the anime or the manga will have him use those Quincy abilities. Because as you guys can tell, aside from the Zanpakuto, Ichigo's really not packing a whole lot of different abilities. Even his fate manipulation that he supposedly has is not very good. Like, Ichigo's fate manipulation pretty much just amounts to you going to Taco Bell and the guy making your taco gives you a little bit of extra cheese because you wanted some cheese. Not really enough to win you the fight, but it is mildly convenient for you. Now, on that note, let's go ahead and talk about our boy Alibaba, Ichigo's competitor. Now, it's been a fat minute since I put out my Sinbad video, so maybe some of you guys forgot what these characters are capable of, and I will give you a quick refresher course here, because we do not have 45 minutes to go over all of the different Magi scaling, the lore, all the different series. We ain't got that time, so I'm just going to give you guys a quick refresher on how strong these characters are. So essentially, you have two different versions of the characters. You have the normal world characters where they're just existing in the normal universe, they're vibing, they're hanging out. And then you have the Sacred Palace version of all the characters where they get to like hyperversal levels of power. Because as soon as people started getting introduced to the Sacred Palace, all sorts of shenanigans started happening, like an infinite god hierarchy, and then you had the core of all the Rook and different dimensions being brought into it. Things got really crazy really fast, and that's kind of why I just split the characters into normal world and Sacred Palace versions. Because in the normal world, essentially everybody in the verse that's even worth their salt should be 4D. Because essentially how it works is that like the Magi verse is like our three-dimensional place that we live in, right? But we were introduced to a thing called Rook, which is essentially the power source of the verse. Now, Rook is a higher dimensional construct that is introduced to the lower dimension, and people use that for all sorts of magical spells and making things. Kind of standard, generic, like magic storyboarding here, right? Like, it's just like, oh, magic is introduced and it's crazy. But the main thing is that people use this higher dimensional Rook energy for combat as well, and people are able to tank attacks from the Rook, and they're able to use it pretty freely for all their attacks as well. It's just like the generic power system of the verse, very similar to something like Ryatsu or Chakra. Now, the reason I say it's 4D, it could potentially be higher, but it's just, since they live in the three-dimensional space, and the Rook is said to be a higher dimensional ability, I'm just going to go with 4D, although you could go with anything from 4D to like infinite D, right? It could be 376,000 dimensional, right? Because they never specify its dimensionality. And again, people in the very beginning of the series are able to tank attacks from these different Rook blasts, which it's the Rook itself, just the raw Rook is already 4-dimensional. And then people mold it and create things with it. So being able to tank a raw blast from the Rook is pretty insanely good. And again, anybody that's even remotely worth their salt can do this. Now, the reason things get crazy when it comes to the Sacred Palace is because we have an infinite god hierarchy where basically Sinbad, who you could probably say is like the third protagonist in the show, essentially wants to go up this infinite god hierarchy, and he just wants to keep beating up gods until he's the top of the infinite god hierarchy, which each is like one-dimensional transcendence above the last. So he's like, I'm the 4D god, I want to go beat up the 5D god, then I want to go beat up the 6D god, and so forth. It actually gets potentially even crazier than this because Sinbad's ultimate goal is to reach the top layer of the infinite hyperversal transcendence, and then go in dimensional transcendence above that, which would be 1A, although he's never able to reach that goal because Alibaba and Aladdin are like, hey my dude, this might be a little bit whack, how about we don't do this? And through some shenaniganery, Sinbad is convinced to join their side and not be an insane maniac that tries to fight 1A beings. By the way, if you haven't read Magi, now would be a really good time to tell you it's a very fun show to watch, and a very good manga to read. Go ahead and read it, it is well worth the read. Anyway, essentially how Alibaba scales to this is he just fights some of the versions of Sinbad in the Sacred Palace, and the Sacred Palace version of Sinbad is the one that's already at the top of the dimensional hierarchy. He's essentially sitting at the top of the infinite hyperversal transcendence, and he's like, alright, now that I'm up here, if you guys can prove to me that your way is correct and my way is wrong, I will stop trying to do what I'm trying to do. And basically everybody that goes up there, whether it's Hakuryu, Judar, Aladdin, or Alibaba, they all essentially have to fight different versions of Sinbad, so they get some scaling and some capacity. Now, I'm not really going to be using that Alibaba in this video. I just wanted to mention that, yeah, we do have like an infinite hyperversal Alibaba over here that we're not going to use because I don't think that's fair. Like, Ichigo did not sign up for all that smoke. But then again, people that read Magi would not be happy with me if I didn't mention it. Although, as far as speed is concerned, I mean, they just kind of have the inaccessibles thing going on passively. Because a lot of the different places in Magi just have no time, like the Sacred Palace, the Dark Continent, the place where the dragons live, they're all just like timeless voids. that characters are able to go visit and just kind of can vibe and exist in, which is just a baseline feat for inaccessible speed. Which, if you're not aware, essentially just the Cliff Notes versions of it is you have finite speed, and then you have infinite speed, which is infinitely faster than finite speed, and then inaccessible speed is essentially taking those levels of infinity and then stacking them on each other, or being like infinite plus 1, or infinite plus 2, or infinite squared. That's inaccessible speed. It's just different layers of infinity stacked on top of each other, and it is lower than immeasurable speed. Now, if you didn't get all of that, just know big zoom zoom very, very quick. That's all you gotta know. Then finally we have his abilities, which Alibaba has just not the best, craziest catalog of abilities. He's not like Sinbad or Aladdin or Judar or Hakuti or anything, which makes him a really nice matchup for Ichigo, because essentially how Ichigo has like big Zangetsu in his show, and they're like, oh, that's the big Chungus sword right there that can cut through anything. It's literally the same thing for Alibaba. Him having Amon, which is the name of his sword, is literally just a big fire sword that he actually can fire big fire Getsuga Tenshos from. Again, similarities to Ichigo. And in his verse, Amon is considered to be the cut through anything sword. You guys know what I'm talking about. Every verse has this guy who's like, I can cut through anything, or this sword can cut through anything. That's Alibaba and Magi. That's the whole point of his sword. It's the cut through anything blade. But really outside of that, outside of it just having like a Jin living in it and having the ability to manipulate fire, it's really nothing super special. Again, making it very comparable to Zangetsu, where Zangetsu is just like a big meat cleaver that shoots energy blasts. He does have some unique, interesting hacks that I don't really think are going to be very useful in this battle. Like, for instance, he's immune to Sinbad's influence. Sinbad being a character that has like charisma out the wazoo and can just influence people to do things just based on his charisma alone, and who also has the ability to manipulate fate itself. The fate part is pretty important because, you know, Ichigo, people like to wank off his fate manipulation, so even if they wanted to say that Ichigo has this crazy fate manipulation that lets the Taco Bell guy give you extra cheese on your cheesy gordita crunch, Alibaba would be able to resist that because he's unaffected by Sinbad's fate manipulation. But the other part, him being immune to like super charisma, I really don't think is going to be very applicable, because I really don't know very many times where Ichigo's been like, yes, here is my dominating charisma that's going to influence the masses. It's pretty much Ichigo's just a very chill, mellow guy that kind of just goes and does things. Like Ichigo, he also has the ability to fly, although his is a bit more free, because as soon as he uses a Jin equip, he just gains the ability to fly, whereas spiritual entities are kind of dependent on like the Ryatsu level of the place they're at to be able to fly. Like, they're like, well, we can't fly in the Soul Society, but we can fly in the World of the Living because the Ryatsu's a little different. So I guess his flight ability is just a little more free than Ichigo's. But definitely the most impressive thing that Alibaba has is his Magoi manipulation. It's the main thing people like to reference when they do talk about him in versus battles, because essentially the thing that Alibaba has that makes him so crazy is this insane hyper concentration ability. So essentially, this is going to sound ridiculous, but my man got turned into a sausage. Don't ask me how or why. If you want to know why he got turned into a sausage, you got to go read Magi. We ain't got the time to explain the lore of Sausage Man, okay? But just know he got turned into a sausage and he had to figure out how to move as a sausage man. And so while he was this sausage man in this dimension of no time, he figured out how to move and how to fight and just kind of do everything normally. So when he got his human body back, he gained this hyper concentration ability where every action feels like an eternity to him. So essentially, Alibaba always makes the right choice, because not only does he have an infinite amount of time to analyze every move that his opponent is making, but in the Magi verse, he is the best swordsman alive. Because not only did he train under the best swordsman, his master Shao Kahn, but in the end of the series, he actually beat Shao Kahn in a duel, and Shao Kahn actually just blatantly says, this guy is just more skilled than I am. He is just a better swordsman that has finally surpassed me. So it's a really deadly combo when you give the best swordsman in the verse the ability to infinitely analyze every single move his opponent is able to make. And I think with that being said, you guys kind of know where this versus match is going. While they are pretty relative when it comes to their power, you know, both of them being in this 4D range, with Ichigo having some scaling to Yuha, who's able to destroy different dimensions in different realms that you could argue are like infinite 3D to 4D as well. Alibaba having a bit more of a solid claim because he doesn't have to really argue all the weird minutia. Magi's pretty clear about things being different time spaces and being different dimensions, but, you know, I'm willing to grant Ichigo the benefit of the doubt to say the realms are 4D just so they can at least fight on even ground. The problem is that Alibaba is just way too fast, and he is just a far better fighter than Ichigo could ever hope to be. Ichigo does fight people that have like hundreds of years of experience, but when you're fighting people that are quite literally like the best swordsmen to have ever lived, transcending like different time spaces, it just seems a bit more impressive than a couple decades to a couple hundred years. But then even if we kind of equalize the experience of both the fighters that they're beating, it's still Alibaba's the best swordsman in his verse, whereas Ichigo's more of a brawler type fighter who doesn't really rely on skill, and Alibaba can analyze every single move that Ichigo's ever going to make in an infinite amount of time to analyze what the best move will always be to make, and he'll just flat out beat him every single time. And the problem is that since they're very relative and they have a very similar skill set, it's not like Ichigo can just brawl his way through it. A good example would be someone like Lancelot versus Kojiro from Fate. Kojiro being Alibaba in this scenario, and Lancelot being more Ichigo, where Ichigo's not completely unskilled, but he's definitely more of a brawler, whereas Kojiro is pretty much all skill, and the all skill is pretty much going to win every single time, especially if they're relative in power. So with that being said, let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts and opinions, but just know that the boy Ichigo is going to have to take a fat L on this one. But if you have any other versus ideas that you'd like to see, go ahead and drop those in the comments down below as well, or you can ping me in the Discord as well. Although if it's some whack versus match that I've never seen before, like if you're like, hey man, I would like to see Monkey D. Luffy fight a Charizard, I'm not doing that one for free, bro. Like, that ain't gonna happen. But if it's something pretty normal and you're like, hey man, I want to see like Obito versus, I don't know, Coyote Stark over here, I might be like, that's kind of interesting. Well, that's not very interesting, but you know, it's just an idea. It's just an example, all right? Look, if it's something I've already seen, like if it's Bleach versus Naruto, Magi versus Bleach, Magi versus Naruto, something like that, I'll probably do the matchup if it is just cool enough for me to do. So yeah, with all that being said, enough rambling, I'm going to go ahead and get out of here. You guys have yourselves a nice day. Peace, late guys.